Welcome to Horror Bytes on Safe Room, the show where we discuss the smaller scares and teenier terrors available to play on your gaming devices. Every week we pick one or two bite-sized horror games and have a suitably short and sweet chat about them. I'm Neil Bolt, and working over and over time with me this week is, as ever, my co-host Jay Krieger. How are you doing, Jay?
Doing well, man. As usual, I'm trying to decipher my reality and fact from fiction, but as you said, it has a bit of a loop component to it this week.
Indeed it does. Before we get into that, of course, the usual housekeeping that we like to do. Now, suppose you do like the sound of what we've played this week, you'd want to try it for yourself, of course, and well, you'd be in luck because the show notes will always be including a link to the games that we discuss. And as ever, if you do enjoy the game, please consider supporting the developers by donating, wishlisting their future projects, or just sharing the word because it all helps in building the next generation of horror game developers. Anyway, with that out the way, for this week's pick, Corio Pixel Games' workplace horror game Loop Error is our choice. And in this, you play a gas station employee who is called in to work late one night to check on your workmate and an important client because nobody's responding. So, reluctantly, you head off into the bitterly cold night to investigate, and of course, bad things are afoot. You end up caught in a strange loop in this remote gas station, and it turns out this place is very keen to keep you there. Can you escape? Well, you'd best play it to find out. So this is kind of similar to a lot of things we've been playing, I suppose, in recent months, or an amalgamation, I suppose, of certain things we like, like pixel art that's bordering on the realistic, but in a sort of grainy, CCTV-esque almost way, isn't it? I mean, there are like some pixelated versions of real images, I think, in this one. It's a bit sort of choose your own adventure point and clicky, but it's a very distinct style. It's mostly presented in a black and white format, but there's like lots of variations in text, some cool animation that sort of mixes things up as well in what you're doing. But yeah, the initial sort of introduction to this is, as I've just explained, where you are put into this sort of first person view of like this conversation you're having with your boss, basically saying, someone needs to go there and check out because no one's answering, and there's this client coming to fill up at this gas station. And yeah, you get a choice effectively, but there's choices in this game to a degree, and they change little things, and obviously that's going to be the point going forward. But yeah, straight from the off, you get a soft tap choice, which is basically, should you go help, shouldn't you? It's like, well, you're going to be led down a certain path here with that one, but it's just to sort of introduce you to the idea. I think writing-wise, straight away, you get some nicely to sort of descriptive scene setters. Like I said, about telling you about cold, telling you about that time of night. When he's on his drive to the gas station, talks about like the darkness outside the headlights of his car, and just like how it feels like nothing exists outside of the headlight space, and like that. It builds a certain kind of fear and atmosphere of this time. And then obviously the story itself happens, which is you kind of black out and just wake up in this. Well, it's the gas station, but there's weird shit going on. Now, it's difficult to get into too much of it because story reliant as it is. But yeah, as I said, the idea is you are, as much as you want to escape it, it's clearly taking people in and keeping them there, and you basically kind of puzzle your way out, which the game does make a sort of nod and a wink to, am I someone who's been stuck in a puzzle game sort of thing? And yes, you are. Yeah, so in that sense, it kind of reminds me of a lot of things I've seen already, which, especially in, the structure I'm talking about, when there's certain beats that you get in a lot of like small scale horror games, like in certain build-ups to certain moments and certain dialogue choices, and even when you have like the unexplainable, there's a very familiar pattern of a lot of them, and I do think this game does have a few of those, maybe too many,
Mm.
But I think what saves it in that regard is you kind of have a unique flavor in terms of how it looks, how it's presented, and that does make it easier to swallow. I don't know why I noticed it more here than I did with, say, many others I think we've covered in recent months, where especially when we've been covering games in this sort of style, in terms of gameplay structure.
Mhm.
But maybe it is just because we've been doing that that it sort of felt more present here. But yeah,
Yeah.
it didn't really hurt it for me.
Mhm.
It was just more noticeable. Did you find that at all?
I did, yeah. It was one of those things where I think I appreciated the fact that this game has the setup for, this is supposed to be a fractured interpretation of someone whose mind was, potentially altered, or someone that has been dealing with various issues. And that's a component of the game that I can touch upon briefly afterwards. But like, I found that this game kind of like hit certain beats that were predictable in terms of like the setup for things. But at the end of the day, like, I don't know, I thought that it has a really unique presentation, and also just like the variety of routes that this could take potentially.
Yeah.
I think when we cover games such as this, like a big feature typically is like find how many endings there are, which is not usually something that I'm like always super keen on. But here, I thought that there was at least enough variation in terms of like the paths that I actually wanted to find the other endings. It wasn't kind of like these minor deviations. It was like, no, the game opens up in a way that I was really surprised by, despite the fact that it has some of the familiar trappings, whether that's like pacing or plotting, or, there's probably like 3 or 4 jump scare moments that I kind of just like rolled my eyes at, considering how strong I found the rest of this to be. But other than that, like, I think that this is a game that utilizes that underlying thematic of just like deciphering between reality, fact, and fiction. Because then there's like the mental health aspect of the game's narrative, right? And the fact
Yeah.
that in exploring these horrors, you're actually exploring a inner struggle and an inner horror, if you will, of the protagonist that they themselves have been struggling with prior to what's been happening in their immediacy. So I think ultimately, like, this was one of those games that, yeah, it kind of like abides by certain um, frameworks, or at least like certain, I suppose, stylistic things or genre standards that we've kind of like come to like with these sort of like visual novel, choose your own adventure. It's got that fantastic pixel, sort of like dot matrix almost visual style,
Yeah, yeah, it's nice.
um, which I think was like quite good here. And it further just like really aids that notion of like acting fiction. And yeah, like, I think what they do with font is actually really interesting here.
Yeah, very much
They
so.
play around with the font, and you get these weird messages, and then the screen goes black, and then they basically fill up the entire screen, or the ways in which when you sometimes make a decision, or also like to emphasize certain things in the environment, you get this like very crudely drawn X's or markings and things like that. And like, yeah, just like little touches like that, I think stylistically do a good job of breaking up sort of like, again, that particular art style that we've seen before. But there's like these little touches to kind of emphasize whether it's a narrative beat or just like overall adhering to a new tone or something like that. But yeah, I think in terms of the decisions you're making, it's not like all that, uh, they're not like deviations from what we're used to. But again, like the different pathways that this narrative takes, I was a fan of, because let's see, I probably took 3 different pathways in playing through this game a couple of times, and each one is like distinctly different than the one that came before it. It's not these minor deviations. So there is some replayability there, and further just like refines that mental health angle, which we're being very vague about, but it plays out in some interesting ways.
Yeah, the story sort of leads you on that pathway quite early on to sort of hint at where the character's sort of mindset is at in some ways.
Mm.
Um, I think what you were saying there, about the differences that do come up in taking these different outcomes. I think it is helped by the fact that there is an unpredictability to like the overall style of it. While we have this very consistent, like I said, dot matrix sort of visual look to like the imagery. The font changes and the manipulation of that does definitely help, I think, in sort of giving a distinct difference. I think this is where I think it does keep it fresh, and make it not feel like just anything else. But I also think that might be why I didn't feel as hot on it as I thought I would, is because it maybe doesn't feel as cohesive as it needs to. I get, thematically, I understand why, why the fonts are different, why things like that turn out that way. But it sometimes it feels like, is this just thrown in for the sake of throwing it in, sort of thing? Like, and there are certain things that don't work with the written word if they're not well described. While there are moments where stuff is really well described and well written, there are moments where I just the dialogue's a bit ropey, doesn't quite fit the moment, and it's again because you're reading it rather than hearing it, it makes it harder to sort of you have your own very distinct version of how that sounds like that. And I think there's an image actually is on the game page which happens in the game, like when you're basically like questioning reality, and like a person puts their hand up and it's just like there's multiple fingers like that. I don't know, it just felt that was the kind of thing that instantly felt to me like like it feels a bit too trying too hard to do a certain kind of thing, like doing that checklist of like established horror moments. And that's a shame because, like I said, there is subtlety to it, and I think where it does go with the character's story in those multiple pathways, there is nuance, there is subtlety, and it does have a respect for it. But it's almost like it's in the wrong order, I think that might be it. It just there's moments like that where you just think maybe we're going a bit too hard, too fast there, because they'll drag it back a bit. And I know the loop plays a part in that, but I don't know. It maybe the type of game it is the wrong type of game for the story being told to a degree. Like it needed to be so. Ambition is great, we'd love to see a game be ambitious, but it does mean that sometimes you bite off a bit more than you can chew, and that for me is how it felt. Like there's great ambition to do something really sprawling, like bigger than this. I think it feels confined and spilling out in various different ways, which is probably why it doesn't feel as coherent as it might want to, even with that sort of metiness that is inherent to the story. That's not unnatural for games of this size. That it is about a 30-minute game. Maybe a bit more depending on how much you sort of delve into the different endings. But it kind of needs to be full of that, which is a compliment, I suppose, because it shows there's much more to it. There could be more. And that's always promising. But better to say that than, oh, it's a write-off. No, don't worry about it.
Yeah, I think for me, this was one where, to your point, like some of the writing was quite nuanced, but then it feels a little bogged down sometimes in like him just describing things, especially early on. It was one of those things where it's just like, we could move this along, or we don't have to have another line of him just like bitching about his boss or bitching about this or that, because like there's one line that stood out to me that was something along the lines of like, I used to like, clearly, again, mental health is a focus here, and one of them is talking about not having a lot of joy in life, and used to play video games for the joy of it, and then says now I just play to meet the sounds of my own life. Like those types of lines I thought were like pretty good. And then you also have you have entire sections of dialogue where something scary happens and it's him saying what the fuck, what's happening, like that kind of stuff. And it's just like I wish we had less of that, because it's like the player themselves should be thinking those things. We don't need the protagonist to like literally spell that out for us. But
it's shorthand, which said with the size of the game, like it needs to be a certain pace, and it kind of gets caught between trying to be something that is more methodical and something that's realizing, well, we kind of got to wrap this up, sort of thing. And which again speaks to the idea that this could be bigger and be a more expanded game, and that'd be great.
Absolutely. And just in finishing up, I just want to give a thank you to Cult Games PR for providing us codes for this chat.
Yes, thank you. It was this is the great thing, as well, being sort of given these opportunities to try things out that maybe have been necessarily on the radar straight away as well, which is excellent. And like Doug just said, for the faults we can find, I think ambition is the root cause of any faults we have found. So, that's, as we always say, that's always a positive for Horror Byte. But that is it for this week. Thank you again, Jay, for talking about these short horror games with me. And of course, for you, the listener, if you have a short horror game, a demo, a game jam entry, or a proof of concept that you think we should be highlighting, you can email us at saferoompod@gmail.com. And Jay?
People can follow us over on Blue Sky at SaferoomPod for show updates.
There we go. We will be back with more small-scale horror next week.